There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a small town in August. Everything slows down. Schools are closed, families gather. Life, for a few weeks, contracts into something smaller, quieter, more ordinary. On the afternoon of August 26, 2010, a 15-year-old girl left her home in Avetrana, a small town in the province of Taranto in the south of Italy. She was going to visit her cousin. The distance between her front door and her destination was a few hundred meters. She never arrived. At first, it looked like a disappearance, a teenager missing in a quiet village, the kind of story that gets filed, reported, and eventually resolved. But what investigators would uncover over the months that followed would point somewhere far closer than anyone expected. This is the story of Sarah Scazzi, and the question that would haunt Italy for years. Sarah Scazzi was born on April 4, 1995, in Busto Arsizio, a town in northern Italy. By 2010, she was 15 years old. She was about to begin her second year at a hotel management school. By all accounts, she was a normal teenager. She had friends, she had a family, she had plans for that Thursday afternoon. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon on August 26, 2010, Sarah left her home. She was heading to the house of her cousin, Sabrina Misseri. Sabrina was 22 years old at the time, born in Taranto on February 10, 1988. The two were cousins, and according to what was known at the time, they were close. The plan was simple. Sarah would go to Sabrina's house. The two would head to the seaside together, along with a friend. It was a summer afternoon. It was a short walk. It was, by every visible measure, entirely unremarkable. But Sarah never arrived at her cousin's door, the kind that takes under 5 minutes to walk. What strikes you when you look at the facts of that afternoon is how close everything was. The distance between Sarah's home and Sabrina's was just a few hundred meters, not a long journey, not a dangerous road, not a place where, in theory, anything unexpected should happen. And yet, something happened in that space, in that gap between one front door and another, something that, at the time, no one could explain. The disappearance of Sarah Scazzi was reported by her mother that same day, and what began as a missing persons case would eventually become one of the most intensely followed criminal investigations in modern Italian history. The disappearance received immediate media coverage, almost immediately. And in those first days, before investigators had much to work with, before anyone knew what had actually happened, the media began to construct a narrative. It was a narrative built not on evidence, but on speculation. Journalists and commentators turned their attention to Sarah's private life, her habits, her secret diary, her Facebook profile. They analyzed everything they could find, looking, it seemed, for a reason that would explain the disappearance in the simplest possible terms. The picture that emerged, the one that filled television segments and newspaper columns throughout the early days of the investigation, was of a restless teenager. A girl who had been engaging with boys much older than her on social media. A girl who, some suggested, may have planned her own disappearance, who may have wanted to become famous, who may have wanted to escape from a small town where she was bored, where she felt trapped, where, according to this version, she frequently argued with her mother and felt oppressed. It was a compelling story. It was also a story that the investigation, as it developed, would move well beyond. Because while the media was building this portrait of a troubled runaway, the people who actually knew Sarah were saying something very different. Her friends denied the characterization, her relatives denied it, and her cousin Sabrina, publicly on television, continued to insist on a very different theory entirely. According to statements made at the time, Sabrina, along with the rest of the family, maintained that Sarah had not run away, that she had been kidnapped, that someone had taken her. It was a position the family held publicly and consistently, and at the time, it was the position many people believed. What no one understood yet was what that insistence might actually mean. From the outset, the Carabinieri, Italy's national military police, pursued two primary lines of investigation. The first, that Sarah had left home voluntarily. The second, that she had been kidnapped, specifically by someone who had made contact with her online. The online contact theory was taken seriously, particularly given the context of Sarah's social media activity and what investigators understood at that stage about her digital life. It was not an unreasonable starting point. The search continued throughout September. For weeks, there was no body, no confirmed crime scene, no definitive answer, just an absence. And into that absence poured a remarkable amount of media attention. Sarah's mother, Concetta Serrano Spagnolo, appeared on television. Other family members appeared on television. Her cousin Sabrina appeared on television. Appeal after appeal was broadcast to the Italian public, calling for Sarah's return. It was a family that appeared, to viewers across Italy, to be in visible distress. A family united in its desperate hope that Sarah was alive and would come home. And it was into this media environment, this landscape of appeals and cameras and national attention, that the investigation would eventually introduce its first significant twist. But first, there was a phone. On September 29th, 2010, more than a month after Sarah vanished, a mobile phone was discovered in a field, not far from her home. It had been partially burned. That detail, a burned phone, was significant in itself, because a phone that has been burned is not simply lost. A phone that has been burned has been deliberately destroyed. Someone had wanted it gone. But what drew the investigators' attention as much as the phone itself was who found it. The phone was found by Michele Antonio Misseri, born on March 22, 1954 in Manduria, Sarah's uncle, Sabrina's father, the husband of Cosima Serrano, who was herself the sister of Sarah's own mother. Michele Misseri, a farmer, a former immigrant to Germany, a man who, along with his wife Cosima, had, according to what was reported, practically raised Sarah in their home at various points. When he found the phone, Misseri reportedly claimed that he had the ability to find his niece, that he knew where to look. That claim, at the time, registered with investigators. A burned phone found by the missing girl's uncle, found in a field, and a man who seemed somehow to know where it would be. Suspicion around Michele Misseri began to grow. Not proof, not certainty, but a quiet, gathering suspicion that something about this man's involvement in the story was not yet fully visible. On October 6, 2010, Misseri was brought in for questioning. The interrogation lasted approximately 9 hours. And at the end of it, Michele Misseri confessed. He stated, at that time, that he had killed his niece Sarah. He claimed that he had murdered her following an attempted rape, and he told investigators where he had hidden her body. A water collection well, located in Contrada Mosca, in the countryside outside of Avetrana. At the time of his confession, this was understood as a breakthrough, a resolution, grim and disturbing, but a resolution nonetheless. A man had confessed. He had pointed to a location. The case, it seemed, was moving towards a conclusion. But this was not, as would soon become clear, the end of the story. It was barely the beginning. Investigators followed Michele Misseri's directions. They went to Contrada Mosca, a rural district in the countryside surrounding Avetrana, and they found a well. Inside it was the body of Sarah Scazzi. She had been missing for 41 days. She was 15 years old. What happened next has been described repeatedly across years of Italian media coverage as one of the most extraordinary and deeply disturbing moments in the history of Italian television broadcasting. The discovery of Sarah's body was communicated to the family and to the public live on air. On the Rai program Chi l'ha vista, a long-running Italian television show dedicated to missing persons cases. Sarah's mother, Concetta Serrano Spagnolo, was in the studio that evening. She was a special guest. She was there, as she had been so many times in the preceding weeks, to make another appeal, to call for her daughter's return. The news reached the program as it was broadcasting. The news that a body had been found. The news that it was Sarah. Concetta Serrano Spagnolo learned that her daughter was dead, while the cameras were running, while Italy was watching. Sarah's body was buried on October 9th at the municipal cemetery of Avetrana, beside her maternal grandmother. She had been 15 years old. She had been walking a few hundred meters to visit a cousin, and now she was gone. But even as Italy grieved, even as the cameras finally went quiet, the investigation was far from over, because Michel Misseri had already begun to change his story. An autopsy was conducted on Sarah's body. The results were significant. According to investigators, the autopsy did not confirm the sexual violence that Michel Misseri had described in his initial confession. And so Misseri retracted. He walked back the claim that he had abused Sarah. He stated now that he had not done so. But the retractions did not stop there. On October 15th, 9 days after his initial confession, Misseri confirmed something investigators had already begun to suspect. He stated that his daughter Sabrina had been involved in Sarah's death. He described it at this point as something that had begun as a game and turned into an argument. The following day, October 16, 2010, after a 6-hour interrogation, Sabrina Misseri was arrested on charges of complicity in murder. She was 22 years old. 5 days later, on October 21st, the Taranto GIP, the preliminary investigation judge, validated the arrest. The validation was based in part on testimony from Sabrina's friend, Mariangela Spagnoletti, who reported that Sabrina had appeared agitated in the period after Sarah's disappearance and had repeatedly insisted that her cousin had certainly been kidnapped and that the Carabinieri needed to be notified immediately. At the time, that insistence had seemed like the behavior of a worried cousin. In retrospect, investigators began to see it differently. On November 6th, Misseri changed his version again. This time, he stated that the murder had been committed by Sabrina alone, that he had not been present. That Sabrina had called him only after Sarah's death to ask for help in hiding the body. 3 confessions, 3 versions, 3 different accountings of what had happened in that house on that August afternoon. Each one pointing somewhere new. Each one redirecting investigators, each one raising, rather than answering, a fundamental question. As the investigation developed, prosecutors began to construct a theory of motive. It is important to be precise here about the language. This was what the prosecution argued, what they presented to the court, what they believed the evidence supported. At the center of that theory was a young man. His name was Ivano Russo, a cook from Avetrana. According to the reconstruction presented by prosecutors, Sarah had met Ivano in December 2009, a few months before her death. He had struck up a strong friendship with both cousins, both Sarah and Sabrina. Sabrina, prosecutors argued, had developed feelings for Ivano that went beyond simple friendship. According to Ivano's own declaration, as documented in trial proceedings in the first days of August 2010, And possibly around August 3rd, he and Sabrina had a sexual relationship, but Ivano had made clear he did not want this to become something more. What happened next, according to prosecutors, set in motion a sequence of events with catastrophic consequences. Sarah, it was established, told others about the episode, about what her cousin had told her regarding Ivano. This generated gossip, the kind of gossip that moves quickly in a small town, and eventually that gossip reached Ivano himself. According to investigators, Ivano's response was to end his relationship with Sabrina, definitively, just days before Sarah's death. Prosecutors argued that this sequence, the betrayal of confidence, the gossip, the severing of the relationship, built within Sabrina a growing rage directed at her cousin. That rage, according to the prosecution's theory, had been building for some time. But it reached a particular intensity on the evening of August 25th, the night before Sarah's death. At a pub in the village, in front of witnesses, there had been a confrontation between the two cousins. It is worth noting what the trial witnesses actually confirmed at this point, and what they did not. The witnesses confirmed that Sabrina had reprimanded Sarah at the pub that evening. Sabrina's own explanation, as presented at trial, was that her cousin had been publicly and openly showing affection towards Ivano, behavior that Sabrina feared would generate further gossip in the village. Whether what happened at that pub represented a decisive escalation, a final argument, or something more ambiguous, the court would have to weigh in its deliberations. What prosecutors maintained was this: that the following afternoon, when Sarah arrived, or attempted to arrive, at her cousin's home, whatever had been building between the two girls reached a fatal conclusion. For months, the focus of the investigation remained primarily on Sabrina and her father. Then, on May 26, 2011, 9 months after Sarah's death, another arrest was made. Cosima Serrano, Sabrina's mother, Michelle Misseri's wife, the sister of Sarah's own mother. She was arrested on charges of complicity in murder and kidnapping. Part of the evidence against her centered on phone records. Analysis of those records showed that Cosima's mobile phone had made a call from a garage, a specific location within the family home, at a time when Cosima had stated she had not been there. The Carabinieri of the ROS, the Special Operations Group, described this circumstance as one of compatibility during their deposition at a hearing in March 2012. And then there was the testimony of a florist. Giovanni Bucolieri was a flower seller from Avetrana. His testimony, and the extraordinary complications that surrounded it, became one of the most debated elements of the entire case. Bucolieri initially stated that on August 26, 2010, between 2 and 2:20 in the afternoon, a time window consistent with the disappearance, he had seen two women forcing Sarah into a car, grabbing her, pulling at her, compelling her against her will to get inside. The two women he described were consistent, prosecutors argued, with Sabrina and Cosima. But Bucolieri later stated that he was no longer certain the event had actually happened, that he may have dreamed it or imagined it. Both the First Instance Court and the Court of Appeal considered Bucolieri's initial words reliable and compatible with the overall reconstruction of events. This, but the uncertainty he introduced, the oscillation between "I saw it" and "perhaps I only dreamed it," remained one of the most controversial threads running through the entire trial. 5 days after Cosima's arrest, Michelle Misseri was released from prison. The terms of his precautionary custody for the crime of suppression of a corpse had elapsed. He was free. But the story, now reaching into the lives of 4 family members, was far from finished. Preliminary investigations concluded on July 1, 2011. 15 people were formally indicted. The charges ranged from complicity in murder to suppression of a corpse, kidnapping, theft, false statements, obstruction of justice, and more. The trial itself opened before the Court d'Assises, the Court of Assizes, of Taranto on January 10, 2012. The main defendants were 3 members of the same family. Sabrina Misseri, accused of voluntary homicide. Her mother, Cosima Serrano, accused of complicity in homicide. Her father, Michel Misseri, accused of suppression of a corpse. The municipality of Avetrana joined the proceedings as a civil party. As the trial progressed, the contradictions that had defined the investigation continued to multiply. Ivano Russo testified. He confirmed that he had been in a brief relationship with Sabrina and that he had ended it. During his testimony, he recounted a detail that the court would note carefully. On the evening that Sarah's body was discovered, the evening the news broke live on Ci l'ha visto, he said that he and a friend named Alessio Pisello had accompanied Sabrina to the Mosca district. This was where her father, Michel, had just led investigators to the well. Sabrina had gone, Russo testified, on her instructions after speaking with her mother by phone, her mother who had been following the live television broadcast. There was one detail in Russo's testimony that would be quietly noted. Sabrina had not known the way to the Mosca district on her own. It was her friend Alessio Pisello who showed her the route. Then came December 5, 2012. At a hearing of the Court of Assizes of Taranto, Michel Misseri, answering questions posed by his own daughter Sabrina's lawyer, broke down in tears and publicly confessed in open court to being guilty of the murder of Sarah. His lawyer resigned immediately following those declarations. The trial was suspended while a new legal representative was found for Misseri. It was a moment of extraordinary theater. A man standing in a courtroom, weeping, claiming sole responsibility for a murder that prosecutors had attributed to his daughter and wife. The court would have to decide what weight to give those words, and what that decision would be would take months more to arrive. On April 20, 2013, the Court of Assizes of Taranto delivered its verdict. Sabrina Misseri and Cosima Serrano were sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Sarah Scazzi. Michel Misseri was sentenced to 8 years for his role in the suppression of a corpse, for concealing his niece's body, and for the theft of her mobile phone. Carmine Misseri, Michel's brother, was sentenced to 6 years for his role in the concealment of the body. A nephew, Cosimo Cosma, received the same sentence. Sabrina's former lawyer received 2 years for personal aiding and abetting. The verdict was appealed. On July 27, 2015, the Court of Assizes of Appeal in Taranto confirmed the life sentences for Sabrina and Cosima. It confirmed the 8-year sentence for Michel. For Carmine Misseri, the sentence on appeal was revised to 5 years and 11 months. There were complications in the appeals process that added to the already extraordinary legal timeline of this case. The reporting judge had not filed the written reasons for the verdict, a fundamental legal document, due to what was described as a technical problem. More than a year after the conviction, the reasons had still not been submitted. This delay, according to Sabrina's defense lawyers, damaged their client's right to pursue further appeal. On July 29, 2016, at the request of lawyer Franco Coppi, the Minister of Justice Andrea Orlando launched a ministerial inspection of the Taranto court. The reasons were eventually published in August 2016, 6 years and 3 days after the crime had been committed. The CSM, Italy's judiciary oversight body, opened a disciplinary file against the magistrate responsible. The case then moved to Italy's highest court. On February 21, 2017, the Supreme Court of Cassation issued its final ruling. The life sentences for Sabrina Misseri and Cosima Serrano were confirmed. The 8-year sentence for Michelle Misseri was confirmed for suppression of a corpse and tampering with evidence, including the theft of Sarah's mobile phone. 4 years and 11 months for Carmine Misseri. 1 year and 4 months for Vito Russo Jr. and Giuseppe Nigro for personal aiding and abetting. After 7 years of hearings, confessions, retractions, testimony, and counter-testimony, the verdict was final. In the written reasons for their 2017 sentence, the judges of the Supreme Court of Cassation set out their reconstruction of how Sarah Scazzi had died. It is important to be precise here. What follows is what the court concluded based on the evidence presented over years of legal proceedings. The court determined that the crime was attributable to 2 people. It had been committed by strangulation using a belt. The court noted something specific about the condition of Sarah's body. There were no signs of struggle, no signs of an attempt to loosen the belt from around her neck, no defensive marks that would indicate she had tried to remove it. The court's reasoning on this point was precise. The absence of those defensive marks indicated, in the court's assessment, that the strangulation could not have been the work of a single individual. Instead, it must have involved the coordinated action of 2 people, one who had carried out the act of suffocation from behind, and one who had prevented the victim from attempting to defend herself. The court further noted that the only 2 people documented to have been present in the house at the relevant time were Sabrina Misseri and Cosima Serrano. Following Sarah's death, court records show that her body was taken to the garage. It was then disposed of, concealed in the well at Contrada Mosca, by Michelle Misseri with the assistance of his brother Carmine and his nephew. The staging of a kidnapping by a third party, the disappearance story that the family had presented to the public, to the media, and to investigators throughout September, was, the court found, a deliberate construction, a strategy aimed at achieving impunity. In the language of the court's written reasons, Sabrina Misseri had acted as a shrewd and cold driving force towards false leads. She had, the court determined, exploited the media to misdirect the investigation, the appearances on television, the tearful appeals, the expressions of grief and fear broadcast to millions of Italian viewers. All of it, in the court's assessment, part of a calculated effort to divert investigators away from the truth. As for Cosima Serrano, the court noted that she was a mature adult. Rather than intervening to de-escalate the confrontation that had arisen between Sabrina and Sarah, rather than acting as a parent and an aunt, she had instead been directly involved in restraining her niece and had materially participated in the commission of the crime. The motive, as reconstructed by the court, drew on the emotional history between the 2 cousins, the gossip, the broken relationship with Ivano Russo, the argument the night before, and what the court described as an emotional short circuit that had made murder possible. The court also identified a second driver of motive, the desire, felt particularly by Cosima Serrano, to protect the image of her daughter and the reputation of the family, and to punish Sarah for the embarrassment that the disclosure of Sabrina's private life had caused. It was, the court concluded, premeditated. Not a single impulsive act, but a crime that had grown from accumulated resentment and a cold determination to act without consequence. The legal process did not entirely end with the 2017 ruling. There were further proceedings, further complications, further controversies. A second trial, focused specifically on false testimonies and the acts of misdirection carried out during the investigation, concluded in its first instance on January 22, 2020. 11 people were convicted in that proceeding, including Michelle Misseri, who received 4 years for self-slander, and Ivano Russo, who received 5 years for false testimony. However, those convictions were definitively canceled on June 17, 2021. The crimes had become time-barred, meaning the statute of limitations had expired due to the prolonged duration of the proceedings. In 2018, the European Court of Human Rights declared admissible an appeal lodged by Sabrina and Cosima. But on November 29, 2024, the court declared the appeal inadmissible on the merits, ruling that it did not contain the necessary elements to be accepted. In March 2022, the Court of Cassation denied a request for release from prison submitted by Sabrina Misseri, one of several such requests that courts had rejected. Today, Sabrina Misseri and her mother Cosima Serrano, the two women whose relationship with Sarah Scazzi began in a family, share a prison cell. And Michel Misseri. On February 11, 2024, he left prison in Lecce, more than a year ahead of the end of his sentence, having received sentence reductions. He returned to his home, his villa on Via de Leda in Avetrana, the same town, the same streets. In interviews given following his release, Misseri continued, as he has done consistently, to maintain that he alone was responsible for Sarah's murder. The Supreme Court of Cassation had concluded otherwise. But Michel Misseri has never stopped telling his version. What to make of that? What weight to give the continuous, persistent claim of a man convicted not of murder, but of concealment, is something the evidence and the courts have already addressed. The verdicts stand. The unanswered questions, and there are some, are not about guilt. They are about the nature of a family, about what could drive a mother to stand by while a 15-year-old girl died, about what could move a young woman of 22 to turn against a cousin she had known since childhood, who had confided in her, who had trusted her, who had walked a few hundred meters on a summer afternoon because she simply wanted to spend the day at the sea. Those questions don't have clean answers. They never do. The case of Sarah Scazzi entered Italian public life in a way that few criminal cases ever do. It became a subject of national conversation, of sustained media scrutiny, of profound debate about justice, family, and the role of the camera in a criminal investigation. The Supreme Court's finding that media appearances had been used in the court's assessment to misdirect the investigation was a stark conclusion. That the appeals for Sarah's return, broadcast to millions of Italian viewers, were concluded by the court to have served as part of a calculated strategy of misdirection rather than genuine attempts to find her. Sarah Scazzi was born on April 4, 1995. She was 15 years old when she died. She was buried on October 9, 2010, at the Municipal Cemetery of Avetrana, next to her maternal grandmother. She had been walking a few hundred meters on a summer afternoon to visit a cousin. What no one understood on that afternoon, what took investigators months and courts years to establish, was that according to the final ruling of the Supreme Court of Cassation, Sarah had not been taken by a stranger, not by someone online, not by someone she had never met. According to the court's findings, what happened that afternoon took place inside a home she knew well, among people the court found to be responsible for her death. And that, perhaps, is the detail that stays with you. Not the crime itself, not its mechanics or its legal classification, but the fact that on an ordinary August afternoon, a girl walked a few hundred meters towards people she had grown up with, people she called family, and did not come back.